Okay, so Jamie, thank you for taking the time to talk to me and the students at the University of Waterloo. You're in a unique position in some ways to talk about democracy. You're in Ottawa. You've been involved in Canadian politics for some time, including as a fundraising director, which seems to me that in politics is where the rubber hits the road in some ways because you have to be very conscious of people's beliefs and the alignment of what the parties do with what they might be willing to donate money for. So that in the same way as for a company, the rubber hits the road when they get someone to give them money. That must also be the case for a fundraiser. And so we're going to talk today about democracy. I think a really important subject today, changing or certainly the scope of some concern perhaps at the moment. But I thought I would start by asking you to just talk a little bit about why democracy is important and what you think it would be like to live without democracy in Canada, perhaps.
Well, thank you, Peter, for having me and for such a great question to start off with. What I would say is, I think living in a liberal democracy and in a democracy. Number one is I've never lived anywhere but in Canada, and so I don't know what it's like to live under a different system. But sometimes when political things are getting rocky and the government's about to fall, I have wished for a less democratic system. Or when the votes haven't gone my way, I was like, if I could just if we could just make this call on it. So number one is I think number one is sometimes a non-democratic system might be more orderly. It might be more stable, but I think you would have less freedoms, and I think there would also be less freedoms for minority groups and groups outside of the main majorities, or fewer human rights. I think in countries where there's less democracy and a liberal democracy, I think you see um, more policing issues. So a lot more brutality in policing, a lot more imprisonment, and people being held for political reasons. So I think where it might be more orderly, and you may you might be able to start a business and understand where things were going to go, because the guys in charge are always going to be in charge, and it's the same group. And once you network into that group, your network is set. You don't have to worry about the landscape changing in the next 4 years. But I also think that it's more difficult, I think, to be innovative. I think the supports for business are different. And I think that overall, I think it's the not the stronger system for people, and for humanity, and for investments in health and welfare of the citizens of the country. That makes sense.
So yeah, so it'd be fair to say that you think it's better to live in a democracy than in a country which is not.
I do. I think that if you're in Singapore, the streets are probably cleaner. But God help you if spit out your gum on the street, right? And
Yeah.
so that is the balance, right? Like where do you want to live? And I think the immigration, people coming to Canada and the US and other Western democracies, we see that there's a reason for that. People want to be here and dream of coming to places like Canada. And I think our democracy is the biggest part of that.
Yeah. So some are arguing today that democracy is outdated, that it was a good system for the past, but maybe it's not so appropriate for the future. How would you respond to that?
Well, number one is I want to know what they'd want to replace it with. Because I haven't seen a country come up with a system, a post-democratic system that worked better than democracy. I think democracy is imperfect. I think, I think it can always run better. I think that we go through periods where democracies become more liberal and less liberal. And so there's times when, governments are, stricter, and there's, less rights and more, and then things, broaden. We've seen that in Canada when we went through the Second World War. We had internment camps, and we did some really terrible things as a, even as a democratic government. And so that was very illiberal. And then we go through periods where we go back and we look at what we've done wrong and we correct for it, and we, apologize, and we put new laws and new human rights and the charter in place, and that protects people going forward so that we don't make the mistakes of the past. So I think it's the best system that we've come up with so far. And if people think there's a better system, I defy them to see, ask what it is and outline it, because well, democracy isn't perfect. I haven't seen a better system.
And your answer seems also to say that democracy adapts based on the weaknesses that people perceive it to have. It's able to respond and perhaps improve itself in some way.
Right. So the most important aspect of democracy is accountability. And so where you have the mechanism to hold people accountable for the decisions they've made in the past and vote them out of office, or go back and look at them, or even have the openness in society to be able to criticize your leaders, you have the ability to fix the wrongs of the past. Or, there's no system where you're not going to make mistakes. Humans are never going to be perfect. I don't think we can hope for the best and want to do better. And I think we should always be striving to do better and have better government and more open government and, more rights for more people. But at the same time, we have to work together. We have to live together in society. And so there's always going to be rules. So I think it's important we get the right balance of what our rights are and what our responsibilities are in a democratic system. And when those get out of balance, I think that's where we see issues start to crop up.
Yeah, citizens have rights, but they also have responsibilities within a democracy to contribute to. Okay. So how does the internet impact the practice of politics today? What has changed? How is it impacting the practices of Canada's political parties and political activism in Canada too?
Well, I think it's changed in a number of ways. I will tell you, when I started working in politics and when I was in high school, we were still hand copying phone numbers out of the physical white pages, the telephone listings, and to phone people and ask them for their support. And so that's changed a huge amount. The first things that parties started doing, they started getting lists. Instead of getting paper lists from Elections Canada, we started getting electronic lists, and we started keeping databases. And the databases have become quite a bit more powerful over the years. And we've been able to, parties have been able to, gather information and, talk to voters and know if a voter supported you last time, if they're going to support you this time. And so we balance those with the rights, of course, of privacy for our citizens and voters. So privacy becomes very important, but it's also, political parties want to knock on your door and ask you how you're voting. And so the political parties are always going to want to know more. And so a lot of that has started to happen. And there's not necessarily the political parties, but there's also a lot of companies that have cropped up around politics in the US and in the UK that do a lot of polling, and they have come up with models, and the models have become a lot more complex and complicated. The companies are using psychosocial models. They're using online behavior to kind of figure out what people think and what people think on one issue, if that tracks to another issue. So if you have this belief on issue A, does that mean that you will support this party, or are you going to support that party? And so there's all these complicated models and things that are happening with polling. And I think that's one of the biggest developments, is that companies, political parties can see a lot of information about people, or have that information that they can kind of use to build models around, what they think people are going to, how people are going to vote, what they think the impact of one message versus another will be, and testing out what they think, one message might do versus another. I will say though, in Canada, we have very different rules from the US. And so in the United States, there's a lot of information available to American political parties on, kind of how people, privacy rules are very different. And there's a lot of information that American political actors have that Canadians do not. So in Canada, there's, I've never seen a database that says, you're on app that links, this is you on Amazon. All of your stuff is. We don't have that in Canada. We've got privacy rules that that kind of preclude, gathering that much information. And also, there's not as much money in the Canadian political system, so there isn't as much. There's less sophistication than you might think, just because the amount of money spent in Canada versus the U.S. is a small fraction of what they have in the States.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that the objective of the political parties to win the support of people to vote for them and support the things that they want to do
Right.
remains the same, but that's changed, or the tools that are available to do that have introduced a new degree of sophistication to what they're able to do to craft their messages and presumably also develop policies.
Right. So in a lot of ways, politics has stayed the same. So politics has always been about talking to voters and introducing yourself as the candidate and trying to convince voters to vote for you. And so, the it's the same as it always has been, but where we're knocking on those doors has changed. So I think, if you look 20 years ago, nobody had a Ring doorbell camera. And so when you went knocking on doors as a candidate 20 years ago, you knocked on the door, nobody knew who was there until they opened the door, and you get to speak to someone, talk, have a quick discussion about, I'm your candidate, introduce yourself on the doorstep. And that was a process and something that happened every 4 years. And things have changed. People aren't answering their doorbells or answering their phones. People used to have landlines, and there used to be white pages, and we don't have those listings anymore. So there's no listing of cell phone numbers, and not everyone has nobody wants to answer doors anymore, or if they do, they have a camera and they're recording, which changes the interaction I think that a candidate is having when it's, when it may be taped versus when it's just having a conversation on the street. So there's all sorts of things that have changed that have shifted the political environment a little bit. So candidates have to be, I think we've seen candidates become a little bit more performative, but that's because there's cameras everywhere. And so I think that's part of the challenge is, authenticity. How can you be authentic as a candidate when, everyone on the street now has become potentially a gotcha journalist, right? And so there's a lot more happening, or there's a lot more happening all the time, and it's hard. You don't get a day off, right? You can't go to the grocery store because somebody's going to have a camera at the grocery store, and maybe you have to talk to someone about an issue in the grocery store aisle, and you might have had to do that 20 years ago. Someone might, accost you as the local member of parliament or the local city councillor, and you could have just had a conversation with them. But now a third party is going to be recording it, and someone else, put it on YouTube. And so there's a whole bunch of considerations that have changed the landscape entirely for politicians and for citizens and for how we operate in society.
Yeah, which has extended also into other areas of life too. Police officers, for example, are in a similar sort of situation.
Right, police officers, teachers, and even parents and private citizens. So, everyone I think wants their 15 minutes of TikTok fame. Some people more than others, and so I think we're starting to navigate that and create different rules. As a culture of what does it mean to be in public and what does it mean to be in private, and how we start to navigate that.
Yeah. Another area I wanted to talk about is the impact of technology on the traditional media landscape and the impact that that has had on that the political impact that that might have. Our view has been, or the theory at least has been, that the traditional media held politicians accountable and played an important role in the operation of democracy. How do you think that has changed with the internet and so many more sources of information?
Well, I think it's changed a lot. I think, the viewership has changed very rapidly, and the changing business model for the traditional media has meant that their budgets have been squeezed and their coverage, the way they cover things, has changed. So we're not seeing as much coverage of local news. We're not seeing very much coverage at all of municipal news, municipal councillors, and I would challenge your students to name their local municipal councillor, the local mayor of the city they live in, and if anyone in your class can name their school board trustee, I I would give them a gold star for that. It's challenging because they're not seeing it in the paper, they're not seeing the issues covered, and media outlets don't have the money to send reporters to report on these issues. And so when there's no audience for it, so people aren't getting those local newspapers, they're not checking mail at their door. It's not the same as it used to be. So we used to all kind of, if you think of like a Norman Rockwell kind of life, or Leave It to Beaver, those visions of the 50s, father came home, everyone sat down at the table and watched the 6 o'clock news or watched the 11 o'clock news. The 6 o'clock news is not the same 6 o'clock news it was 20 years ago. The coverage is the same. There isn't the same amount of local coverage. Families aren't watching cable news as much as they used to. People aren't tuning in to the news shows. They're getting news from either comedy shows or from TikTok or from Facebook groups or Facebook messages. So the amount of news that we're getting is coming from different sources and different pieces. It's not as cohesive, and it's not necessarily coming from a trusted source. So news it's become harder, I think, for citizens to get that news. And at the same time, it's harder to, the news has been maybe democratized. So anyone can go out and start gathering news or put up a Substack and start writing about the news. The kind of the guardrails or the guardians or the editorial boards have all been pulled away. So we used to have a lot of, editorial boards and publishers and people who were charged with kind of managing what it was that was going to be on TV or what was going to be in the newspaper or what was going to be seen. And that's been democratized, which I think it can be a good thing, but it's also, who do we trust? And so that, I think, is driving some of the polarization, is choosing who you trust versus who you don't, who maybe doesn't quite have things or has a different spin. It's difficult, I think, for consumers to know who to trust and who's got good information versus bad information. And it's changed political campaigns and how candidates behave as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the importance of this is that access to information, knowing what politicians are doing, being able to consider the issues, the different opinions on a topic, access to all of that for a voter is very important inside a democracy. That operated with this important role of the traditional media in the past, but you've described how that landscape has changed and potentially makes certainly democracy more complex for individual voters, but also, if they're not receiving or truthful information, then it'll affect the decisions they make and the views that they hold.
Right. I think that's part of the discussion that we have to kind of have around how we regulate tech companies and how we as a society where we get our information, and and the information that we need to decide who to trust. And so it's become very easy. I could spin up a website and a Substack and have it look just as professional as the CBC or the CTV. I mean, I could steal the code from the CTV website and put up a mock CTV or CBC news site tomorrow, and it's not that difficult. And the news, it can look really realistic or real, or a headline that you see on in a clip for 30 seconds as part of a TikTok. That might have come from a really great newsworthy news source, and it might have come from something that is not quite real, that was maybe sponsored by a foreign government or a company. And so there's been all these changes. And one of the really interesting things that's happened, and it might be a bit too far into the weeds, and is that as the news media has kind of been shrinking, public affairs companies have been growing, and public affairs companies have been hiring a lot of the journalists. And so how we get our information used to be, you'd have a public affairs person, and they would go out and talk to the newspapers and the journalists. And now the journalists are working for the public affairs, and then they're presenting things online, and just going direct to the consumer, direct to the politicians, direct to people, and bypassing the media. So it's democratized, but it's democratized in a way where some people are starting to figure out how to get that advantage, how to get that content, how to get their content seen, how to put things in front of people in a way that's enticing, engaging, and to move their ideas forward. So we're starting to see there's money here in trying to influence voters and influence consumers in new ways.
Yeah, I mean, we have traditionally thought about the traditional media as having some ethical or moral obligation to pursue the truth. That hasn't always happened necessarily, but that is something that's associated with the traditional media, whereas many of the sources of information that have grown are not based on that principle, right?
Right. And even, we have, journalistic associations like, the Association of Broadcasters and the Association of, they police themselves. They have a set of journalistic standards, broadcast standards, journalistic integrity, and the cable TV, the traditional broadcasters are all subject to these rules. But social media companies are not broadcasters. The streamers are not broadcasters, and so they're not subject to the rules in the same way. And I think as Canadians, we're going to have to grapple with how we regulate kind of going forward, because it can't be the Wild West forever. I think you want to, in order to get innovation, it's great to kind of have that regulation pulled back a little bit for a little while to let people innovate. But at a certain point, it's, for the safety of citizens, for the interest of, of the people, you have to come back in and say, okay, what's going on here, and where are the incentives, and start to look at how you need to regulate.
Absolutely. So perhaps related to this, to what extent do you think technology is responsible for political polarization? First of all, do you think there is political polarization going on? Most people seem to. But then, if there is, does technology have a role to play in that?
Yeah, I think there is political polarization. I think I think it's being driven from a number of different sources. I think inequality is one of the drivers. I think there's an urban versus rural split. There's regional splits in Canada. There's men and women are polarized to a certain extent, and so there are all these kind of factors of polarization. But now that we can kind of curate our own online environments, I think that that drives the polarization even further. A few years ago, everyone was watching cable TV. So on Friday night, I think 80% of North America was probably watching three channels, right? You were either watching ABC, NBC, or CBS, and in Canada, maybe you were watching the CBC, or CTV was pulling that feed. So everyone was watching the same thing. It made the culture more homogenous, and now nobody's getting the numbers that people used to get in the Nielsen ratings in the 80s and in the 90s. And we're all watching kind of super specialized things and have our little fandoms and wiki groups and cliques, and we either watch this podcast and we're on Reddit in these groups. And so the way we consume media and information has changed, and we're not getting we're not all seeing the same things. And then the cultures that we belong to are kind of driving that polarization. So yeah, I think polarization is an issue, and I think it's going to continue until things kind of change and rebalance a bit. I think I'm a big believer in, I'm an optimist, and I believe that things get out of balance and come back to balance. And I think government regulation and society will do that. Things will get out of whack, and then we'll pull back. So I can see polarization going, but I think we'll start to see things that will start to bring some of those ideas back together.
So just on this question of regulation, you've mentioned a couple of times that regulation is something that you think is necessary as far as technology's role in democracy is concerned. Have you got any thoughts on what that might look like, or what would be done?
I have lots. I spend probably an inordinate amount of time thinking about this, but I come from a fundraising background, and the major principle in fundraising is transparency, right? So not only do we set limits in Canada on how much people can give, because we don't want any one group to have an outsized influence in our political life. So we limit in Canada quite severely what people can donate. So the individual donation limit, I think this year is something around $1,700. It may plus or minus 100, and so if the most that I can give is $1,700 and the most that you can give is $1,700, then the chances of someone being able to get the politician's ear is a lot less than if you're in the US and you can donate several million to a candidate. So that's part of it. And the transparency also is any donation over a certain amount is listed and filed with Elections Canada and is published. So the list of people who donated to political parties in Canada is public. It's public information. And I think that's part of where we haven't caught up in regulating technology, is that we haven't got to the transparency piece yet. So, number one is, I think, at a certain point, Elon said he was going to start regulating the bots, and we haven't seen it. I haven't seen it yet, but we need to. I think as citizens and voters, we need to know who's real and who isn't. Who's a real person, who isn't a real person, and if someone's saying something, we need to know. We need all of the information in order to decide if that's a credible source. So I think that the principles around how we regulate technology, it needs to be less around content and more about transparency, because I think the censorship is a challenge, and if you're thinking about putting in a rule or a regulation around censorship, just think about your worst political nightmare being in charge of the system that you're building, and then decide if it's a good idea. So I tend to err on the side of letting people say what they're going to say, but having to be transparent about who they are when they're saying it. In the way that in the there were anti-masking laws passed in the U.S. South to stop the Ku Klux Klan, right? So you weren't allowed to wear a mask. You weren't allowed to hide your identity in order to spread evil, racist ideas. And so in the same way, I think we need to kind of unmask people online because there are some terrible things being said online. I mean, if you look at um, if you look at comments on Twitter, comments on a Facebook video, um, on certain topics, the comments are just horrific, and nobody would stand up in Tim Hortons and say those things. And so they shouldn't be, it shouldn't be free to say those things online. I think people need to start putting their money where their mouth is, kind of, in some of these things. And so that's where I would, um, if I was if I was in charge for a day, I would focus on ways to make the system more transparent. Which is not to say that privacy is not important. So what I'm reading, what I'm consuming, what I'm looking at online, what I'm clicking on, what I'm searching on Google, those should all be private. To me, that's private. I'm not publishing those. I'm not publishing those ideas. That is my information about me, what I'm reading. That's all private information for me as a private citizen. But as soon as I start to broadcast, um, you know, as soon as I start to broadcast things out, and I'm putting out a TikTok video, and I'm becoming a content creator, and it's beyond, um, or I'm becoming a commenter on things, then I think that if there's a difference there versus, whether you're owed privacy. I don't think you're owed privacy when you're commenting on a story on on a newspaper article, or if you're commenting on something on Twitter. I don't think you're owed privacy in that setting. But I think, the tweets that you read, yes, should be private. But the tweets that you're commenting on, or if you're commenting, or if you are on Twitter, I think we need to start tying those to people and having some accountability around those um, around those kind of discussions, if that makes sense. The
Yes.
other side too is just the size of the technology companies, and the amount of advertising they control, and the amount of the marketplace they control, and the amount of the public square that they control. I think you could argue that, Twitter, or what is X, is a public square. And so if one person's in control of, you know who can be there, who can speak, who gets um, who gets promoted, who gets more engagement, and those algorithms, that's a lot of power. And so I think we need transparency around what's promoted, how it's being promoted, what the algorithms are doing, how they're doing it, what's getting, what's getting pushed forward versus held back. I think all of that is fair game to me, for number one, is for just being published what it is, and then second, that's where the regulation should be.
Yeah, and we might hope that with transparency, there would be more responsible behavior and civil discourse as opposed to inflammatory and derogatory, negative, behavior online, which you know is not very pleasant.
Well, and you have to, I think the other part of it too is who wants to run for
Mm.
office. Like, part of what keeps our democracy healthy and vibrant is having lots of people from lots of different walks of life being willing to to run for office. And I think we've seen in a number of cases a lot of women who've said that, I'm out. It's not, this isn't for me. It's hard on my mental health. I'm attacked every day. It's over the top. People are going to politicians' private homes and following them in the streets, and yelling nasty things, and politicians are being spat at. It's I think we need some civility, and I think that the passions are driven online, where everything's anonymous, and then it comes offline in ways that are that are not good for society, and we're seeing a narrowing of who's willing to run, and I think that's unhelpful, and not good for the country as a whole.
Absolutely. So artificial intelligence, there is a lot of focus on it at the moment. Have you thought at all about what that might mean for democracy?
I'll start over. So I think AI, generally technologies are neutral. It's in how they're used. So any technology can be used for good or for evil, but I think with AI, there's a potential for it to get very complicated very quickly, and for the humans who are running the system to not understand what the system's doing. And so there's a really great book that I would challenge some of your students to read if they're interested, by Thomas Homer Dixon. He teaches at that's just not going to stay on, but teaches at U of T, I believe still. It's called The Ingenuity Gap, and it talks about systems and how complicated they get, and how things can very quickly become go beyond our ability to understand them easily. And things are moving so fast that it's hard to correct on the fly when something starts moving. AIs, a lot of them are a black box, and so it's hard to understand what the AI is. Not hard to understand. You don't know how the AI is making the decision it's making. You just tell it to do something, and then it goes out and does it. And so there's been a number of studies that have shown that AIs will sometimes exacerbate unfairness in systems. So there's one case where they looked at AIs for doing hiring, and they found that the AIs preferenced male candidates over women candidates, because the AI saw the discrimination in the system and then doubled down on it. And so the people who built the system had no intention of doing that, but they didn't know how the AI was making its decisions, and then it kind of, rather than solving the problems, it exacerbated them. So I think we have that potential to not understand how the AI is operating, and then have something go sideways. So I think that using AI in small, meaningful, small chunks to do more work, or do things faster, I think those can be very meaningful. But I do see some downsides, in terms of, how do you get your video seen on YouTube? Well, I mean, you could use some really unsavory hashtags to get your video seen on those, but then the people who are then seeing your videos and interacting with your videos, that's going to change the audience, change the people you're bringing in. It changes, and if you're not conscious of what is happening when you're making the decision, if you're letting an AI do it, then there can be some unintended consequences that kind of shift your viewership, or shift your the comments you're getting. And we all live in kind of a feedback loop, right? Like if you see comments on a video, or if you're getting comments on your policy, those all get kind of integrated in, and it moves people either further polarizes, or brings things back to center. So I can see AI being something to be very cautious about. But I think it depends on how it's being used. One of the things I tried to use AI for was to decide how much money to ask people for. If you last gave $10, should I ask you for 12, or should I ask you for 15, or should I ask you for 20? And so I could, design an AI that would look at your donation history and tell me the optimum amount to ask you for. And then maybe it also looks at your postal code and your donation, and says, okay, well, this guy probably has the ability to give $20 instead of 10. And so those are ways that are, I think, kind of innovative and interesting, and low. there's low chance of it going rogue. If you're kind of asking Chat GPT to design your next platform, well, I think maybe maybe you should give your head a shake, and maybe politics isn't quite for you. But I think, again, it depends on how you're going to use those tools. And I think the number one thing is really testing those tools carefully and understanding what they're doing, and understanding that as the person designing the tool, it's your responsibility to make sure that you understand what that tool is doing and how it's, and maybe not how it's doing it, but you need to test and retest and check, how that's working so that you're not accidentally, unleashing something that's going to, damage the country or, cause demonstrations in the streets or, or breach people's privacy or, act in a way that is, in some way unsavory.
Yeah. So turning to something not completely different, but away from what we've just talked about, the political impact of the technology companies. They've become very powerful. There are questions around their compliance with regulation, their attempts to influence governments in what they do. Do you have thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I think people with power in society have power in society. And so the head of Google is always going to have the ability to, get an audience with government officials if they need to. I think that, I think the fact that these these entities are so huge, and their earnings are so enormous. It's very difficult to regulate an entity like Apple or Google, and we've seen companies also, playing regulation arbitrage. Like if there's regulation here, I'm going to go there, and the cost of breaking this law in this jurisdiction is low, so I'm just going to go ahead and break the rules and see what happens. And you saw that with Uber going into new markets. They absolutely knew that they were not in compliance with local laws, and they used put a lot of money into government relations and advertising, and they kind of arm wrestled their way into markets where they were not maybe meeting the regulation there. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I like Uber, but if you're a taxi driver, you probably disagree, right? So I think that you need to look at how we're regulating technology, how big they've gotten. I think I think in the US there's a great argument for breaking up some of the companies. They did it with the phone companies in the 80s. I think maybe it's time for some of the companies that are just controlling too much of the online space. I also I've lost my train of thought there again. So I had another point, but it's escaped me for right now. But I definitely think they've gotten way too big in the amount of influence they have. I think what I was talking about was the where the incentives are. So if you see, for a company, their incentive is always going to be their shareholders, and trying to make money, and that's where the incentive is. And so, as a regulator, to try and change those incentives is going to be difficult for a company with the resources of, say, Apple or Google or Tesla. I mean, the SEC hasn't been able to get Elon Musk to be quiet on Twitter, and so you can just see where those difficulties are. So I think I think the changes need to be a lot more robust in terms of how much money, what the penalties are, and I also think in Canada specifically, our competition law has not had a lot of teeth, and so there's some really great people at the competition tribunal. I have been on the other side of one of their investigations. I did not enjoy it, but they're brilliant people. It was a very big learning experience for me, and they do some really excellent work, and they have a lot of brilliant minds there. but they don't have the tools that they need to really tackle competition in Canada. Um, and I think partly that impedes us in, kind of being innovative and having a lot of productivity is, just having too many big companies, uh, can hurt us.
Okay, I've got just two more questions. You've been very generous so far with your time, but I've just got two more. The first, do you think technology can improve democracy?
I think it can. I think the amount of information that is at our fingertips now as voters is probably unprecedented. You can learn about something, you can figure out, like, I now can go and find out how my MP voted on every issue for the last, however many years he's been in office at my fingertips in about 30 seconds or less on Google, on the parliamentary website. When, many years ago, I would have had to go to the library or, phone someone or look, get someone who had access to Hansard, put it on a microfiche. So I think in that way, technology has, really, given so much information, but it maybe overwhelmed us with information as well. And so I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think the speed also is something that is a bit of a challenge. Information's coming out very fast, and it's hard to pay attention as a voter to all the information that's coming out so fast in a news cycle that is 24 hours, 24/7. And so there isn't that kind of time, for the 6 o'clock. Used to be you just got your information at the six o'clock, the 6 o'clock news. But now my phone is dinging every 30 seconds and with breaking news. And some of the breaking news is, really important. And some of the breaking news is, silly. There's a new TV show on. Well, that wasn't breaking news, but the House of Commons just voted this in. Okay, maybe that's breaking news. The Prime Minister just resigned. Well, that is breaking news. But some of the breaking news, it's hard to, in the attention economy, it's hard to decide where to put your attention, and a lot of it is getting your attention getting sucked up into things that are probably not that important. They feel important at the time.
Okay, just one final question. The influence of foreign actors in domestic politics. The internet seems to have enabled that to take place more easily, and democracies seem to be struggling with it in some ways. What should government's response to it be? Given that they've struggled, I don't necessarily assume that you would that you will have all the answers to this, but what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we have struggled with this, and I think a lot of it goes back to transparency. So the ways that foreign actors are able to influence Canadian politics is through online, online social media, through because they're not transparent. So we don't know where the information is coming from. We don't know who the news source is, and so having transparency in the system would allow us to regulate, or allow us at least to understand what the source of the information coming from. If 500 people are liking something on X, or liking a tweet on X, a politician might think that is, really popular. This got 1 million views, 1 million likes. People are retweeting this. If the 1 million likes and retweets are from a Russian, Russian or maybe they're the British are now, maybe it's a British bot farm. I don't know who's running the bot farms, but somebody's running a bot farm somewhere, and they're engaging with social media content and skewing the way we're viewing the popularity of different ideas, and causing more or less people to see ideas. We need transparency on that. I think that's low-hanging fruit. I think that should have been dealt with probably already a while ago. I think that also, Elections Canada looks at this and they've done a pretty good job of, pointing out, having transparency in the system, especially where money comes in. So it's very hard to get foreign money into the system, but there are a few ways that still money can come in. I think all the traditional parties are really trying hard to make sure that the system stays very transparent and then all the money coming in is very clean. But there's ways, leadership contests, the election of local candidates, those areas that are run by the parties themselves can be open to influence, and it's very hard. It's very hard for the parties to know what's going on. So I think that there are ways in which we can, maybe kind of add some regulation, put a few more rules in place to make sure that the people that are, voting in leadership and voting, voting for the local candidate, that they're Canadian citizens or permanent residents, that they've ties, that they're part of the local community. I think another great way also that we could all contribute to diluting the influence of foreign actors is we could all go out and vote, and we could all go out and participate in a local political party. Right? I'm not going to tell you which political party you should support, but pick one and go be involved, because there are so few, young people and diverse people and young people getting involved in politics. It's number one, it's a great way to network. It's a great way to meet people. It's a great way to meet some really interesting, influential people that might be really good for your career. And there's so few people doing it. If all of us who are kind of in the mushy middle in politics and we're not polarized, if we all got involved and helped pick the candidate and voted more and participated on the local level, I think a lot of these, polarization problems would, they would just dissolve. They would dissolve under the power of humanity to work together in person. I think it works better in person, not online.
Well, I think that's a great way to conclude our discussion, Jamie. I think encouraging people to get out there and participate in politics in the way that you've described is a very is a very important message and a good way to finish. I really appreciate you taking the time to record this interview for people at Waterloo, Jamie. It will be really valuable to them. It'll help them think more about our democracy and how it might develop in the future. So thank you very much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, and reach out again anytime.